ready to unpack a highly controversial, intensely debated worldview.
It is definitely a heavy one today.
It really is. Welcome directly to the show. Today, we have a deep dive that explores a survival guide written specifically for men who feel alienated, marginalized, and systematically targeted by modern society.
Right.
But before we jump into the thick of it, please make sure to like and subscribe to the show. We are reviewing a highly provocative new ebook today, and if you find the ideas we discuss fascinating and, you want to buy it for yourself, you should absolutely check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
Highly recommend grabbing a copy to follow along.
Definitely. And also make sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker at Substack. So setting the stage here, this is a text that it requires a very careful, incredibly thorough analysis.
Because it pulls absolutely no punches.
Yeah.
I mean, right from page 1.
Exactly. The source material we are looking at today is the 2024 ebook Masculine Anger, a red-pilled guide to navigating a feminized world by Conrad Riker. The mission of this dunk dive is to comprehensively unpack the historical framework, the deep psychological theories, and the evolutionary biology arguments presented in this text.
And we really need to understand who this is for. It is a book written explicitly for a men's rights activist audience.
Yes. For red-pilled manosphere men who are trying to understand the history of our modern institutions before they were, as the author vehemently argues, completely captured by feminists and Marxists.
Which is a bold claim that he spends a lot of time defending.
He really does. Now, before we go a single step further, I need to make a mandatory impartiality disclaimer. This source material contains highly politically charged content. We are not taking any sides.
Not at all.
We are impartially reporting on the content provided in this book. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the author, but simply conveying the ideas and arguments contained in the original source material to help you, the listener, understand this specific perspective.
That context is absolutely vital for you, the listener, to keep in mind today.
Right.
The author is directly challenging the foundational narratives of modern Western culture, and he is doing so with a very specific targeted audience in mind.
An audience that already inherently distrusts the mainstream consensus?
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. Conrad Riker starts by framing a sweeping historical redefinition of society.
He goes way back.
He really does. The core premise of the book, right out of the gate, is that modern society has been entirely captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies, creating what he terms a gynocracy.
Very loaded term.
Very. In this system, he argues, men are no longer just disadvantaged. They are effectively treated as second-class citizens, heavily penalized by the very institutions they historically built.
Right. He doesn't just throw this term gynocracy out there in a vacuum. He attempts to build a meticulous historical timeline to prove exactly how this institutional capture happened.
So let's start with his definition of gynocracy. How is he functionally defining this within the context of the book? Because it sounds like he's describing a highly organized matrix rather than just a cultural shift.
That is exactly how he frames it. What's fascinating here is that in Riker's architecture, a gynocracy isn't just a society where women have equal rights.
Right, it's more systemic.
Yes, it is a society where the fundamental structures of governance, law, education, and corporate culture are inherently tilted to benefit female imperatives.
While simultaneously pathologizing male imperatives.
Exactly. He argues that this isn't an accident, but the result of a long, deliberate ideological project. And to prove this, he completely reinterprets the traditional timeline of the feminist movement.
Which is usually taught a very specific way.
Right. In standard academic settings, the first wave of feminism is taught as a relatively straightforward, noble push for basic egalitarian rights.
It's like property ownership and suffrage.
But Riker digs much deeper. He goes all the way back to Mary Wollstonecraft in the late 18th century, specifically targeting her seminal 1792 work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman.
Wait, hold on. So he's tracing the roots of modern female supremacy all the way back to the 1700s.
He is.
How does he justify jumping from Wollstonecraft's historical arguments about female education directly to systemic misandry?
It's a fascinating analytical leap. Riker argues that if you actually read Wollstonecraft closely, the ultimate goal wasn't just a level playing field.
What was it then?
He claims that in Vindication, Wollstonecraft was subtly laying the groundwork for female moral superiority.
Oh, interesting.
She heavily emphasized the supposed virtues of chastity, modesty, and maternal purity, using these concepts to elevate women above the supposed base, animalistic nature of men.
So he views this as the initial seed of a superiority complex.
Yes, but he goes further by attacking her credibility. He spends a significant amount of time pointing out the historical reality of Wollstonecraft's own life.
Like her personal affairs?
Exactly. Her affair with Gilbert Imlay, her out-of-wedlock child, her emotional instability, noting that her life was anything but chaste and modest.
Right.
He uses this perceived hypocrisy to argue that from its very inception, feminist ideology was built on demanding standards of men while entirely excusing the chaotic or hypocritical behavior of its female architects.
So, through the lens of this book, the foundation of the movement wasn't actually about equality. It was about establishing a moral high ground while avoiding personal accountability.
That is precisely his argument.
That is a heavy accusation to level against one of the most revered figures in women's history. But let's move his timeline forward. He takes this seed of moral superiority and tracks it into the second wave in the 1960s and 1970s.
Which brings us to figures like Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem.
Our audience obviously knows these names, but how does Riker reframe their specific contributions to this emerging gynocracy?
Well, he views the second wave as the moment the movement shifted from seeking moral superiority to actively dismantling the traditional social contract.
Oh, so.
According to the book, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique was not the liberating text it is widely celebrated as. Instead, Riker frames it as a calculated psychological operation aimed at convincing women that being a wife and mother was a form of oppressive slavery.
So he's saying she was intentionally trying to break the family unit.
Yes. He argues that Friedan explicitly advocated for the abandonment of traditional gender roles in order to destabilize the nuclear family, which Riker views as the fundamental building block of a healthy, functioning society.
And what about Gloria Steinem? She was the face of the movement during that era. How does her ideology fit into his puzzle?
For Riker, Steinem is the figurehead who openly cemented the idea that male chauvinism, and by extension masculinity itself, is the root cause of all societal problems.
He quotes her a lot in this section.
He quotes her extensively, pointing out how her rhetoric shifted the cultural narrative so that men were no longer viewed as partners or protectors.
But explicitly as oppressors.
Exactly. In Riker's view, Steinem didn't just want women in the workforce. She wanted to fundamentally rewrite the cultural script so that masculinity was synonymous with toxicity.
Which brings us directly to the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the third wave. This is where the book dives heavily into Kimberly Crenshaw and the introduction of intersectionality.
This is a crucial pivot in his argument.
Now, our audience is very familiar with intersectionality as a cultural buzzword, but let's really unpack how Riker connects Crenshaw's specific academic theory to the creation of a pervasive culture of victimhood and female supremacy.
Right.
How does he draw that line?
He dissects the mechanics of intersectionality.
Yes.
Originally, Crenshaw coined the term in a legal context to describe how black women face a unique overlap of racial and gender discrimination.
Which makes sense in a legal framework.
But Riker argues that this academic concept was weaponized. He claims that intersectionality morphed into an overarching societal hierarchy.
A matrix of oppression.
A matrix where your cultural value and your right to speak are entirely determined by how many victimhood categories you can claim.
So it's an inverted hierarchy. Instead of status being derived from competence or achievement, it's derived from marginalization.
Exactly. And in this inverted hierarchy, the straight, white, biological male is placed firmly at the very bottom of the moral ladder.
Right.
Riker argues that intersectionality is what birthed modern identity politics. In his view, this wasn't an evolution towards broader egalitarian equality. It was a highly sophisticated, incredibly effective tactic of grievance.
Allowing modern feminism to extend its reach into every facet of life.
Yes, by constantly discovering new vectors of supposed oppression, thereby continually justifying the suppression of masculine expression and men's rights.
He calls this modern iteration woke culture, and he makes a very aggressive parallel here. He views woke culture as a Trojan horse for Marxism.
He does.
Now, typically we think of Marxism in terms of class struggle. The proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, the worker seizing the means of production.
The classical economic model.
Right, so what are the actual socioeconomic parallels Riker is drawing here to justify calling modern gender dynamics a form of Marxism?
That is a critical question because he isn't just using Marxist as a throwaway insult. He is outlining a structural parallel.
Okay, walk us through that.
Classical Marxism divides the world into the oppressors who own the capital and the oppressed workers. Riker argues that woke culture simply took that exact same Marxist framework and replaced class with gender and race.
So the straight male becomes the bourgeoisie oppressor.
And everyone else is the oppressed proletariat. The ultimate goal, according to the text, is identical: to completely destroy the existing foundational structures.
Specifically, the nuclear family.
Yes, and replace them with a state-sponsored, heavily regulated system of enforced equality or equity.
So, by making men reliant on the state for arbitration and making women reliant on the state for provision, the gynocracy consolidates absolute power.
That is his exact thesis.
And to prove that this isn't just abstract political theory, he provides very specific examples of how this ideology has actually captured major institutions. He looks at academia, the media, and the corporate tech world.
Let's start with academia.
Yeah, it's a common talking point, but what specific mechanisms of capture does Riker highlight?
He focuses on the complete ideological monopoly within universities. He argues that academia is no longer about the pursuit of objective truth, but about ideological indoctrination.
Pointing to specific departments.
Right. The proliferation of gender studies and critical race theory departments, which he claims are fundamentally designed to paint men, historically and presently, as violent oppressors.
Furthermore, he points out a glaring absence.
The lack of support for men.
Exactly. Well, universities dedicate massive resources to women's centers and female empowerment initiatives, courses promoting men's rights, or even objective discussions about the unique sociological struggles of men are entirely absent.
He notes that if a student tries to form a men's advocacy group on a modern campus, they are immediately protested, defunded, and smeared as a hate group.
The silence, Riker says, is deafening, and it proves that academia is an entirely captured institution.
And he traces that exact same ideological monopoly right into the media.
He observes that in modern television, film, and advertising, men are consistently portrayed in one of two extreme caricatures. There is no nuance.
None at all.
Men are either shown as emasculated, bumbling, submissive, stay-at-home dads who can't figure out how to operate a washing machine without their competent wife's help.
Or they're portrayed as hyper-violent, toxic, predatory brutes who need to be restrained by society.
Through Riker's lens, there is absolutely no middle ground for healthy, competent, traditional masculinity in modern media.
And this extends into the corporate world, which is perhaps where the consequences are most severely felt by the average man. Riker uses the specific, highly publicized example of James Damore to illustrate this.
The Google engineer. Our audience will remember the fallout from that, but it's worth revisiting how Riker uses it as a case study.
Damore wrote an internal memo questioning the scientific validity of the company's diversity policies, and the reaction was explosive.
How does Riker analyze the corporate response to Damore?
Riker uses Damore as the ultimate canary in the coal mine for corporate ideological capture. Damore didn't write a hateful manifesto.
No, it was a data-driven document.
Exactly. He wrote a heavily cited, scientifically grounded document discussing biological differences in personality traits between men and women, simply suggesting that these biological differences might explain some of the gender gaps in tech rather than systemic sexism.
And the fact that Google, a company supposedly built on logic, data, and open inquiry, fired him so swiftly and brutally is exactly Riker's point.
For the author, Damore proves that modern corporate environments do not care about data or meritocracy. They exist to enforce woke ideology through strict, punitive codes of conduct that brutally stifle any male dissent.
If you question the Gynocratic narrative, even respectfully, you will be financially destroyed. That is a very grim picture of our institutions.
It is, but Riker doesn't just stop at the ideological warfare. He argues that this institutional capture has a literal, physical body count.
He transitions to discussing the silent epidemic regarding men's mental and physical health. Let's slow down here because the statistics he cites are genuinely sobering.
They are heartbreaking. He isn't just relying on rhetoric. He pulls heavily from clinical data.
Like the APA data.
Yes, he references comprehensive 2018 data from the American Psychological Association showing that the number of men seeking help for severe depression had tripled over the previous 10 years.
He also points to the steadily rising catastrophic suicide rates.
Noting that middle-aged men account for the largest demographic of suicides by a massive margin. Furthermore, he looks at addiction rates, homelessness, and deaths of despair, all of which disproportionately ravage the male population.
And he links all of these tragic outcomes directly to a specific psychological concept. He calls it masculine discrepancy stress.
A very clinical term.
Break that down for us. What exactly is happening in a man's mind and body when he experiences this specific type of stress?
Masculine discrepancy stress refers to the severe psychological conflict and the immense cognitive dissonance that results when men are pressured by society to conform to expectations that are fundamentally at odds with their biological nature.
So it's the friction between who a man is biologically wired to be and who society demands he pretend to be.
Exactly. The book cites a highly revealing study from the Journal of Men's Health, showing that this specific type of stress isn't just about feeling sad, it has a profound physiological toll.
Because the body keeps the score. You can't just suppress your biological imperatives without your nervous system reacting.
Precisely. The study shows that the stress of society demanding men constantly police their language, suppress their natural competitiveness, and neuter their masculine traits to conform to feminized, HR-approved expectations is linked directly to severe physical health risks.
We are talking about chronic spikes in cortisol, leading to cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and severe immune system suppression.
Essentially, the author is making a physiological argument. Forcing men to suppress their natural anger and their inherent masculine traits isn't just making them unhappy, it is literally biologically killing them.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the book pivots entirely from sociology into evolutionary biology. Riker makes the core foundational argument that masculine anger is not toxic.
It is not a character flaw.
It is not a psychological defect, and it is certainly not a disease to be cured by therapy or medication. It is a hardwired, finely tuned evolutionary survival tool.
He looks back at our hunter-gatherer ancestors and points out that anger was a biological necessity.
It was required for survival, for fighting off predators, for establishing order within a tribe, and for fiercely protecting kin from rival groups.
And he grounds this evolutionary theory in hard, undeniable physiological data. He notes the obvious biological reality that the average male's testosterone level is roughly 15 to 20 times higher than the average woman's.
From an evolutionary standpoint, nature does not waste energy. This massive hormonal disparity exists for a reason. Men were built over millions of years of brutal evolutionary pressure to be the protectors and providers for the species.
He uses analogies from the animal kingdom to illustrate this.
Right, he points to the silverback gorilla beating his chest to ward off a threat.
Or the male lion fiercely defending the pride from nomadic challengers, or even a male bird aggressively puffing up its feathers at an intruder.
In nature, we do not view these displays of male aggression as toxic. We view them as the necessary mechanics of survival and protection.
Riker argues that human males are no different. Our capacity for anger, driven by that massive testosterone advantage, is a deeply ingrained biological mechanism designed to deter threats, enforce boundaries, and assert necessary dominance to maintain order.
But he draws a sharp contrast between how we view that biological reality today versus how it was viewed in the past. If you look back historically, masculine anger wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated.
It was the foundation of civilization.
He brings up the Spartans and their brutal agoge training system, the Vikings and their martial culture, the Roman legions. He mentions leaders who shaped the world through channeled aggression and conquest.
The point he is making is that these patriarchal societies clearly understood that male anger, when properly directed, was the driving force behind decisive action, the building of infrastructure and the preservation of the family unit.
Today, however, that exact same biological drive is completely vilified.
This brings us to a major section of the book, the author's intense critique of the double standard regarding emotional expression in our current society.
It's a huge theme for him.
It really is. He argues that we live in a schizophrenic culture that actively, enthusiastically celebrates female anger as beautiful, empowering, and culturally necessary,
while simultaneously pathologizing male anger as a dangerous systemic threat that must be heavily medicated or socially ostracized.
He uses the Me Too movement to perfectly illustrate this dichotomy.
Walk us through his analysis there.
He analyzes the media framing of Me Too, noting that the collective, raw anger of women was championed globally. Female rage was put on the cover of Time magazine.
It was lauded as a vital force for societal change,
a necessary reckoning, and a beautiful expression of liberation. But Riker points out, when men express collective anger about their own marginalization,
whether it's about biased family courts, lack of mental health resources, or educational disparities,
they are immediately labeled by the media as toxic, unstable, potentially violent, or even flagged by government agencies as domestic threats.
Our audience is well aware of the fallout from the infamous Gillette advertisement, but what's interesting is how Riker dissects the underlying psychological warfare of that specific campaign. For the uninitiated, Gillette ran a highly controversial ad that challenged what they called toxic masculinity, essentially telling men to shave away their bad behavior. How does Riker use this as ground zero for his argument about media policing?
Riker cites the Gillette ad as the ultimate mask-off moment of corporate tone deafness and media policing.
He was very critical of the imagery used.
Yes. He argues that the ad fundamentally misrepresented normal male behavior, like boys wrestling in the yard or men approaching women, as inherently predatory or toxic.
The ad portrayed masculine energy and anger as a disease that needs to be controlled, eradicated, and apologized for.
Riker suggests that this double standard isn't just hypocrisy, it is a deliberate form of psychological warfare.
By convincing men from a young age that their natural aggression and anger is a toxic defect, society effectively disarms them.
It instills a deep sense of shame in them for simply existing as biological males. An ashamed, disarmed man is much easier to control, manipulate, and extract resources from.
To counter this intense societal shaming, the author asks the listener to completely reframe how they view their own anger. He uses a brilliant analogy.
The dashboard light.
Yes. He says, imagine your anger as a dashboard warning light in your car or as a highly trained internal bodyguard. When the oil light comes on in your car, you don't smash the dashboard with a hammer to turn the light off.
You look under the hood because the light is telling you something is wrong.
Anger is the same way. It's an evolutionary signal that your boundaries are being crossed, that an objective injustice is occurring, or that your personal self-respect is under severe threat.
It is absolutely not something to suppress with medication or alcohol. It's something you must pay acute attention to.
And he immediately connects this dashboard warning light concept to the systemic, objective injustices that men face today, particularly within the legal system.
He points a massive spotlight on the family court system.
He notes a staggering statistic. Despite the push for equality in every other sector of society, fathers receive sole custody in roughly 5% of divorce cases.
The presumption of maternal supremacy in family law remains almost absolute. He also brings up the glaring hypocrisy of the military draft.
Where young men are required by law to register to fight and potentially die for their country, while women remain entirely exempt from this ultimate civic burden.
So when a man looks at these blatant systemic double standards,
Rampant paternity fraud with zero legal consequences, hopelessly biased custody laws that strip men of their children and their wealth, the ever-present threat of the draft.
Riker argues that anger is the absolute most natural, healthy, and rational response imaginable.
If your internal warning light wasn't going off in the face of those statistics, something would be biologically and psychologically broken within you.
Exactly. Riker's point is that the anger is justified. The anger is righteous.
But, and this is a massive, but in the context of the book, the text does not simply tell men to be angry and leave it at that.
No, it acknowledges that anger is a highly complex, incredibly dangerous, dual-natured emotion.
It is a razor-sharp, double-edged sword. It has the power to entirely destroy a man's life. Or, if mastered, it can be the ultimate indispensable tool for his personal construction and success.
To really look at the mechanics of these two paths, he uses a couple of specific, highly detailed case studies. Let's spend some time dissecting the anecdotes of Tom and Mark.
Because they are foundational to the practical advice Riker is offering red-pilled men, let's start with Tom. Tom represents the worst-case scenario.
Tom's story is presented as a tragic, cautionary tale. Tom was a highly successful entrepreneur who essentially had it all: the business, the house, the family.
But when his marriage inevitably fell apart, he entered the meat grinder of the family court system.
He lost a massive portion of his assets, he lost primary access to his children, and his anger completely, totally consumed him. He lacked any semblance of emotional control.
He lashed out at his ex-wife, he sent unhinged texts, he ranted uncontrollably to his business partners, and he let his physical health deteriorate.
He let his raw, unbridled, reactive anger become a purely self-destructive force.
He let the fire burn his own house down.
Precisely. It ruined his remaining relationships, it alienated his children, it destroyed his business opportunities because no one wanted to work with an unstable man, and it ultimately cost him his peace of mind.
Tom represents the profound danger of untamed, unrefined anger. He let the emotion master him, rather than mastering the emotion.
And then, in stark contrast, we have Mark.
Mark's situation is different, but the core emotion is the same. Mark is a software engineer working in what Riker describes as a deeply entrenched, highly toxic gynocratic corporate workplace.
The HR department is entirely focused on diversity quotas.
And Mark, despite being the top performer, is being consistently overlooked for promotions. He is doing the lion's share of the highly technical work, while less competent colleagues are promoted over him based on identity metrics.
Mark hits his absolute boiling point, but his reaction is fundamentally different from Tom's.
This is where Riker outlines the blueprint for success.
Instead of lashing out, sending an angry email to HR, or throwing a tantrum like Tom, Mark channeled his intense frustration constructively.
He didn't suppress the anger.
No, he used it as an internal fuel source. He meticulously documented its contributions, he coldly researched market rates for his skill set, and he used the energy of his anger to completely eliminate his fear of confrontation.
He stepped into his boss's office, advocated for himself and his male colleagues with absolute icy precision, successfully negotiated a massive salary increase.
And demanded equal treatment under the threat of taking his highly valuable labor elsewhere. Mark represents anger acting as a controlled catalyst for positive change.
If we connect this to the bigger picture,
Right.
the author is making a brilliant strategic point for the men listening. Raw, untamed anger, Tom's anger, plays exactly, perfectly into the hands of a society that is waiting with bated breath to label you as problematic, toxic, or an unhinged danger.
If you act like Tom, you give the Gynocratic system exactly the ammunition it desperately needs to dismiss you, arrest you, or fire you.
You prove their point for them.
But if you harness that anger like Mark, you use the biological heat to drive personal development, establish firm boundaries, and force the system to respect your competence.
Which bleeds perfectly into how the book meticulously advises men to navigate power dynamics in interpersonal romantic relationships.
He spends a lot of time discussing the concept of shit tests.
A very common term in the manosphere referring to psychological tests women subconsciously use to gauge a man's strength, confidence, and emotional fortitude.
Riker argues that anger is often a very natural, appropriate biological reaction to blatant disrespect or boundary pushing in a relationship. But the absolute key to maintaining masculine frame isn't just feeling the anger.
It's exactly how you wield it.
Yes,
And to back up this relationship strategy, he actually references the work of major mainstream psychologists, which I found fascinating for a red-pilled text. He brings up Daniel Goleman's groundbreaking work on emotional intelligence.
he uses Goleman to prove that having high emotional intelligence, or EQ, does not mean you never get angry. That is a massive misconception.
Goleman's work shows that people with high EQ still feel intense anger. They simply possess the cognitive ability to recognize the emotion, analyze why it's happening, and then use it as a powerful controlled tool for communication and change rather than letting it hijack their amygdala.
He also heavily cites Dr. John Gottman's extensive, decades-long research on couples and marriage.
Gottman is famous for being able to predict divorce with incredible accuracy by observing couples argue. How does Riker apply Gottman's Four Horsemen research specifically to men defending their boundaries?
Gottman's research conclusively proves that it isn't the mere presence of anger that ruins relationships. Couples who never get angry are often highly disconnected.
Rather, it's how that anger is managed and communicated.
Specifically, the presence of contempt, defensiveness, stonewalling, and criticism. Riker argues that communicating anger calmly, assertively, and without aggressive contempt is how a man maintains his self-respect.
When a man enforces a boundary with cold, unshakable assertiveness, rather than whining or throwing a tantrum, he actually increases his value and asserts healthy dominance in the relationship.
So it is entirely about the distinction between being assertive and being aggressive. Aggression is a loss of control. Assertiveness is the ultimate expression of control.
And Riker applies this exact same principle not just to romantic relationships, but to society at large. He moves from the microcosm of personal relationships to the macrocosm of political action.
He introduces the concept of righteous indignation as a necessary social catalyst.
He actually makes a very bold, highly controversial comparison, linking the modern men's rights movement to some of the most significant historical revolutions in human history.
It is a staggering comparison, but he defends it vigorously. He points out that the American Revolution, the suffragettes, the labor movements of the early 20th century, and the civil rights movement were absolutely not born out of polite, quiet requests for incremental change.
They were not achieved by people asking nicely.
They were fueled by a deep, burning, righteous anger against systemic oppression.
He specifically mentions Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. How does Riker, speaking to a primarily red-pilled manosphere audience, utilize these specific civil rights icons?
By focusing entirely on their defiance and their mastery of anger. He notes that neither MLK nor Malcolm X shied away from the intense anger they felt at racial oppression.
They didn't go to therapy to learn how to accept segregation.
They harnessed their fury. They didn't let it devolve into nihilistic, destructive rage that would alienate the public. They weaponized it.
They used the heat of their anger to fuel incredibly passionate speeches, to organize massive logistical protests, to endure physical beatings without breaking frame, and to ultimately dismantle unjust legal structures.
The author is calling for red-pilled men to do the exact same thing in the modern era.
He wants men to use their collective righteous anger constructively to dismantle what he views as gynocratic institutions.
He wants them to aggressively oppose what he provocatively calls the marriage plantation.
The legal system that extracts male wealth through biased divorce laws. He wants them to fight back relentlessly against false accusations, Title IX abuses on college campuses, and the overwhelming bias of family courts.
He summarizes this entire philosophy with a powerful line. It is not our anger that makes us monsters, but our silence in the face of injustice.
But he pairs this passionate call to revolution with a very stern, highly tactical warning. He knows that the system is entirely rigged against angry men.
So he details how modern society, media, and algorithms deliberately set up what he calls psychological traps, specifically designed to provoke men into making fatal errors.
Right, the outrage trap. This is so relevant to anyone who spends time online. The author explains that the modern media ecosystem, particularly platforms like Twitter, TikTok, and Reddit, is essentially a minefield of algorithmic rage bait.
You'll deliberately post articles about how real men are weak.
They will call you toxic simply for having traditional standards for a partner, or they will label you an incel for expressing basic frustration with modern dating dynamics.
Or smear you as a dangerous bigot, simply for advocating for equal treatment in family court.
The entire calculated goal of these traps is to make you lose your cool. They want you to react with unhinged, raw, Tom-level rage.
Because the exact second you send that angry tweet, or yell at that protest, or lose your temper on camera,
They can take that 10-second clip, point at you, laugh, broadcast it to millions, and permanently delegitimize your entire argument and your character.
this raises an important question, perhaps the most important practical question in the book. How do men actively advocate for themselves in a system designed to provoke them without falling into these algorithmic traps?
The author's strategy requires almost monastic discipline. He advises staying absolutely calm under extreme pressure.
He advocates for maintaining absolute unbreakable professionalism in all interactions. He teaches the use of I statements in communication to express boundaries without triggering aggressive defensiveness from the opposing party.
He quotes the ancient philosopher Lao Tzu to anchor this mindset. A man who conquers others is strong. A man who conquers himself is mighty.
He tells men they must act with the coldness of rationale alongside the heat of anger.
I love that phrasing, the coldness of rationale. You feel the immense biological heat of the anger in your chest, but you execute your actions, your emails, your legal strategies, and your conversations with cold, calculating, untouchable rationale.
That level of extreme emotional discipline requires a massive outlet, however.
You cannot simply walk around with the biological heat of primal anger inside you all day, every day, without it taking a devastating physical toll. Your cortisol levels would destroy you.
That is exactly why the book provides very specific, non-negotiable coping strategies for the red-pilled man. And the very first one, the foundation of his practical advice, is the absolute necessity of a physical release.
Because, as we discussed with the evolutionary biology segment, anger is fundamentally a physiological phenomenon. When you get angry because you see a biased news article or your boss disrespects you, your body doesn't know you were in an office.
Your body thinks you are preparing for a physical fight with a rival tribe.
Your heart rate violently increases, your blood pressure spikes, your pupils dilate, and you get a massive, overwhelming surge of adrenaline and cortisol dumped into your bloodstream.
If you don't physically metabolize and release that chemical energy, it turns inward, attacking your own organs, leading to the hypertension and heart disease we talked about earlier.
The author shares a very raw, personal anecdote about discovering this necessity. He talks about coming home after a grueling, incredibly frustrating day working at a manufacturing plant.
Dealing with incompetent management and a system that seemed designed to break him.
He describes feeling like his chest was literally going to burst from pent-up, suppressed rage. He knew if he stayed in the house, he would lash out at his family.
So instead, he laced up his shoes, walked outside, and just started running around the neighborhood.
He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. And he notes that he hasn't stopped running since.
He argues that intense physical exercise, Whether it's lifting heavy weights until failure, boxing, doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu, or just relentlessly hitting a heavy bag in your garage, is not a hobby for the modern man.
It is a non-negotiable, mandatory physiological release valve.
It has nothing to do with wanting to hurt anyone. It is purely about metabolizing those toxic stress hormones so you can wake up the next day with a clear mind, a regulated nervous system, and a healthy body, ready to implement the coldness of rationale.
But beyond just the physical biochemistry, there is a profound psychological and sociological coping strategy discussed in the final chapters. The complex dynamic between the lone wolf and the pack.
Riker spends a significant amount of time analyzing the lone wolf phenomenon, heavily referencing the MGTOW movement.
Our audience knows this acronym well, men going their own way. These are men who have looked at the extreme systemic risks of modern marriage, the bias of family courts, and the hostility of woke corporate culture, and have radically chosen to entirely reject traditional societal paths.
They choose a solitary, independent existence to insulate themselves from the risks of a gynocentric society.
And Riker doesn't just treat MGTOW as a modern internet phenomenon. He traces this specific archetype back through ancient history to validate it.
He brings up Diogenes, the infamous ancient Greek Cynic philosopher.
Diogenes literally lived in a large ceramic jar in the marketplace of Athens, famously mocking Alexander the Great, deliberately and publicly rejecting all the societal norms, wealth, and status markers at this time.
He also brings up the modern tragic figure of Chris McCandless, the subject of Into the Wild, who gave up his trust fund and societal expectations to live completely alone in the brutal Alaskan wilderness.
The author deeply validates the lone wolf path. He tells his readers that walking away from a rigged game is a completely legitimate, rational response to a hostile society.
However, he reaches a highly critical, nuanced conclusion regarding absolute isolation.
While the lone wolf path is mathematically and logically valid in terms of risk assessment, Riker insists that human biology still dictates our needs.
Finding a pack, a trusted community of like-minded men, is absolutely non-negotiably vital for long-term emotional survival.
He argues that trying to navigate the psychological warfare of a feminized world entirely alone, solely through internet forums, almost inevitably leads to deep alienation, severe depression, and a corrosive, toxic bitterness.
A physical, in-person pack provides a necessary safe space.
It provides a venue to vent frustrations, to share legal or career strategies, and to find vital masculine validation without the constant fear of being judged, recorded, or labeled toxic by the broader culture.
You absolutely need that brotherhood. You need men who understand the terrain you are navigating.
And that brings us to perhaps the most surprising, deeply philosophical coping strategy in this entire red-pilled guide, the chapter on forgiveness.
When you pick up a book with a title like Masculine Anger, forgiveness is probably the absolute last word you expect to find in the table of contents.
But he anchors this chapter with a brilliant, haunting quote from the writer Henry Miller. Every man carries with him his own Atlantis.
It is a stunningly powerful metaphor for the red-pilled experience. Riker explains that for men who have swallowed the red pill, who have suddenly seen the systemic biases and the historical manipulation clearly, this Atlantis is their accumulated historical anger.
It is the massive, heavy, sunken continent of simmering resentment they carry regarding the injustices of family courts, the pain of false accusations, the financial ruin of divorce, or simply the everyday societal marginalization they face.
But Riker points out a brutal truth. Carrying the weight of a sunken continent on your back is utterly exhausting.
It slows you down. And ultimately, carrying that resentment damages the man far more than it damages the society he is angry at.
So how does he define forgiveness? Because he makes it painstakingly crystal clear that forgiveness in this context does not mean turning the other cheek.
It does not mean excusing the society, the institutions, or the specific women who wronged them.
Exactly. He completely strips forgiveness of its traditional religious or altruistic connotations. He frames forgiveness not as a gift of absolution for the offender, but as a deeply selfish, highly tactical, conscious decision for the man himself.
It is the decision to intentionally let go of the burning coal of resentment in order to achieve personal peace and operational clarity. He writes a very defining line. We're not saying it's okay, we're saying it's over.
It is the ultimate act of taking back supreme emotional control. You are refusing to let the institutions or individuals who committed past injustices dictate your current, minute-to-minute emotional state.
You drop the incredibly heavy weight of Atlantis off your shoulders, not for their sake, not because they deserve it, but entirely so you can swim freely toward your own goals.
We're not saying it's okay, we're saying it's over.
That is a very striking, incredibly stoic way to frame it. It shifts the power dynamic entirely back to the individual man.
It perfectly elegantly encapsulates the book's entire mission, transforming masculine anger from a passive state of victimhood and reactionary rage into a highly controlled state of empowered, rational, strategic action.
As we finally wrap up this intense deep dive, let's briefly summarize the overarching mission of the heavy text we've been comprehensively exploring today.
Conrad Reicher's Masculine Anger, a red-pilled guide to navigating a feminized world, attempts a massive ideological undertaking.
It seeks to completely reframe the concept of masculine anger. It takes a raw emotion that modern mainstream society almost universally labels as a toxic, dangerous problem and completely redefines it as a hardwired, necessary evolutionary tool.
A biological imperative and a vital catalyst for necessary men's rights advocacy.
For you, the listener, the core takeaways revolve around developing profound, actionable emotional intelligence, recognizing and actively avoiding the algorithmic outrage traps set by modern media, and maintaining a sharp, unwavering historical awareness of exactly how our societal institutions have shifted over the last century.
It is a text that fundamentally challenges the reader to never suppress their inherent biological nature, but rather to master it with absolute discipline.
It asks men to use the icy coldness of rationale to purposefully direct the intense heat of their primal anger toward constructive personal development and vital societal change. Before we sign off today, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over.
Something that builds on the foundation of this text, but steps outside of its immediate parameters.
Throughout the book, the author relies heavily on the principles of evolutionary biology, correctly arguing that human anger evolved over millions of years as a deeply physical tool for survival, for fighting off literal predators, defending the tribe, and establishing physical order in the brutal ancestral wilderness.
But we don't live in the wilderness anymore.
We live in the digital age. In this modern, highly sanitized era, our ability to physically express our primal instincts is heavily muted, heavily restricted by complex laws, HR departments, and strict societal norms.
Yet at the exact same time, our ideological and verbal expression of anger is amplified globally, instantaneously, through social media, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
That is a profound, entirely unprecedented evolutionary tension. We have the biology of a warrior, confined to a cubicle and a keyboard.
It is.
So the ultimate question I want to leave you with is this. How will this digital age permanently alter our biological relationship with our own primal emotions?
If we were walking around with the exact same testosterone, cortisol, and adrenaline of our ancient hunter-gatherer ancestors, but the only battlefield we're allowed to engage on is a Twitter thread or a subreddit debate, will our primal wiring eventually adapt to a society lived entirely online?
Or by continually trapping ancient, deeply biological anger in a sterile, digital, ideological cage, are we heading toward an inevitable, catastrophic, collective emotional breaking point for modern men?
It's something you seriously need to think about as you navigate the complexities of the modern world.
If you want to dive into the source material yourself and explore these arguments in their full context, make sure to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy Masculine Anger, a red-pilled guide to navigating a feminized world. And a quick reminder to absolutely go follow the author at Conrad Reicher at Substack for more of his writings.
If you enjoyed our impartial, deep dive breakdown of these fascinating ideas today, please remember to like and subscribe to the Deep Dive so you never miss an analysis.
So what does this all mean for you?